Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the introduction to software carpentry for librarians spring forum, sponsored by ACRL University Libraries Section, Technology in University Libraries Committee. So this forum is coordinated by Teresa Carson from Northern Arizona University, Jane Nichols from Oregon State University, and Minhao Zhang from Wayne State University. So today, our speakers are Cam McDonald and Clara Laurente. Cam McDonald is an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science at McEwen University in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. His involvement with software carpentry began in 2009 as assistant. In 2013, he completed instructor training, and since then, he has been an instructor for 9 boot camps, 6 for software carpentry and 3 for data carpentry. So our second speaker is Clara Laurente. She is the data management specialist at Oregon State University Libraries. She has been an instructor for library carpentry since 2016. She has participated in 2 library carpentry and 1 data carpentry workshops, and applies carpentry's curriculum to her research data services work. Clara is recently certified as a lesson maintainer, and she will be participating in the Spanish software carpentry lessons maintenance. So this is a timeline, and we have gone through the first part, which is introduction 1, and following that, each of the presentation session is about 30 minutes long, including the Q&A at the end. Then we have about 5 minutes to wrap up the entire forum session. And let's get started and welcome our first speaker.
Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen with you. I'll start by sharing the librarycarpentry.org, which is our the website for library carpentry. And so this is a great place to go to get lots of information. We just launched this library carpentry website. And I want you to pay particular attention to the background image that we've put behind Welcome to Library Carpentry there. I'm going to switch over to my presentation slides now. And I've actually used the same image. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a question to see how the chat function how well the chat function works. What's wrong with the image? What's not great about using the image I've chosen for the background? You can answer in the chat. I'll just wait 30 seconds. So old dusty books, a little outdated, an outdated view doesn't represent what we do. Exactly. So if anybody has an idea for a better image for library carpentry, you can talk to me afterwards. Where's the tech? Exactly, stereotypes. And so the other disclaimer, of course, is I'm not a librarian. And so this is a bit of it's been a learning curve for me to work with library carpentry. So thanks very much for your answers. You nailed it. So I'm going to talk about this perception of what librarians do and what we as library carpentry are trying to help librarians do in their day-to-day work. So I am an assistant professor of computer science, as was said. You can email me after if you have any questions. I'm at McEwen University, which is a small undergraduate university here in Edmonton, Alberta. I'm on Twitter at CJMcDonald. While I've taught software and data carpentry, I've taught a fair amount of librarians in that time, some of it before there was library carpentry, and so it was a software carpentry lesson for librarians, and then I've also taught ones that are specifically that we would call library carpentry. I'm also part of the library carpentry governance team, so the group that oversees library carpentry, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. How many people have not heard of the Carpentries before? Has everyone had some experience with it, or have people just heard of it last week? Okay, New to people, excellent, excellent. So I'm going to start by talking about what the Carpentries are. Lots of people have heard of it. Some people love it. And so the Carpentries started out of software carpentry. That started in the 1980s by Dr. Greg Wilson and Dr. Brent Gorda at one of the US national laboratories. And what was happening, which has happened in a lot of other industries, was these national lab scientists were having to write computer software because computers were kind of taking over a lot of the research that was going on there. And like a lot of people, they were learning to use technologies that they had no training for. And so the term carpentry really came from the idea of just teaching the basics of, you know, if you own a home or some kind of building, learning how to nail two boards together or put up a wall straight is useful basic skills. And so that's where the term carpentry kind of came for. And software carpentry understands that software and working with digital data in a really effective way is becoming kind of the next form of literacy. We talk about computer literacy, which is, do you know how to turn it on? Do you know how to use different functions of the computer? But do we really understand how software works is becoming an important part of lots of people's jobs. So one of the questions software carpentry focuses on is, are we using the right tools when we're working with research data and software? And so here's some examples. If bioinformaticians, because scientists were again that original audience, if they're using Excel, Excel might be doing conversions, which are actually introducing errors into their data. And so this is a big problem. And a lot of scientists, if something doesn't work right in Excel, they may not know how to actually fix it. They may not know how to work around it. And so they're limited by that tool. And so like a good carpenter, we want to be able to have the breadth of tools and be able to pick the right one. And so software carpentry aims to teach people about other tools so that if you understand your data and you understand how software works with it, you understand that you can use something other than Excel. You're not limited to, or whatever the tool that you happen to be using is. If you understand how that software is manipulating that data, you can pick perhaps a better tool. And so that's what software carpentry really tries to teach. And so they've been doing, the carpentries are very popular, and there's some reasons why they are. They teach high impact 2-day workshops. They've experimented with other lengths, but they found that 2 days was just the right mix of enough time to get deep, but not overwhelming people. We tried 5-day workshops once and it was exhausting. And that learning period where people can absorb new information fits reasonably well within about a 2-day workshop. The lessons are of a high quality. So we heard that Claire is working on translating some working in Spanish. They are looked over by a lot of people. A lot of people teach them, and there's a constant feedback cycle of trying to improve them and make sure they're as usable as possible. They also involve a fair amount of hands-on learning. All the lessons are available for free and are online under a Creative Commons license. To slideshow. We can't see everything in the slides. Okay. Is that better? I can't really switch to full screen, unfortunately, but I am trying to make it work. Okay, thanks. Okay, I'll make it even maybe a little bit bigger just so it's, okay. Okay, I guess it's different screen resolutions. Thanks very much for that feedback. The other big part is the trained instructors. So we heard about people becoming, or you'll hear later about people becoming instructors. We've probably all met people who are very good with technology. They know how to use technology. They understand a lot of the details about it, but maybe they're not the best at teaching it. They're not able to find that common ground, that empathy with that person who's trying to learn. And software carpentry works very hard at helping people become effective teachers. And all of us have usually other day jobs. And so they really have to work quickly to help people overcome things that may not make them great instructors. So we try to teach our instructors a simple example would be to avoid using words like just, like, oh, you just do this, or this is easy, because for a lot of people it's not. And so we really want our learners who are attending the workshops to get the most out of it. We know the imposter syndrome, and that people feel like they don't know these tools, or they're going to make some kind of embarrassing statement. And we work to create a really collaborative, gentle environment where people can say what they know, say what they don't know, and can be helped to bridge any gaps they might have. And the last point I would make is they have a community of peer learning. With the workshops that people can attend, which are 2 days, our hope is that they'll build a community where people can work together, learn like, oh, there's a person who works in this other department at the same university, and we have similar interest in learning how to do this better. And then there's also a great online international community where lots of people help each other. So the community is really, really broad. This N equals 1350, that's the number of people who work in software carpentry as instructors. And these numbers are going up all the time. And even if you're on Antarctica, you can probably find someone who's familiar with software carpentry there. Here's another great little example. This is just from yesterday from one of the staff. Was at 9:22, someone emailed a problem. And the minutes until someone replied with a solution for that particular person was 4. Total 4 different solutions were proposed. And there was, within 10 minutes, there was 20 messages of people, because people can answer those emails and get back. And actually what the problem was with Zoom. They were trying to do trainer teaching, and someone had and they used Zoom for that, just like we're using today. And someone had a Linux laptop, and it wasn't working particularly well. And so fortunately, someone in the community had seen that problem before and answered it. So there's a great sense of community. So that's a little bit about the carpentries. So where did library carpentry come from? So software carpentry, even though it was started in the 80s, it went dormant for a little while, and it really picked up in the mid-2000s. And workshops were being requested from universities, and that's where I began to get involved as a helper. And okay, someone might have their mic on. Can you please make sure you're muted? Thank you. That seems to have solved it. So mostly universities and government institutions were requesting workshops. So while software carpentry was growing, there was a group that said, this doesn't quite fit what we want. We like some of it, but we don't like other parts of it. So particularly, it was the software programming. Some people said, because software carpentry talked about data, some people said, we love these discussions about data, but we're not so keen on the programming. We're probably not going to be writing our own software. And some audiences said, that's really what we would like a workshop on, is just this data piece. And so in around 2014, an organization called Data Carpentry, nice Alberta joke made there in the chat. Very good. So Data Carpentry was started, which again didn't teach programming and the programming elements, but just focused on what does data look like. It talks specifically about some of these issues with Excel. We've probably all seen a very poorly organized and managed spreadsheet in our time, one that uses a lot of different colors and has a bunch of text written around where the data actually is. That makes it very difficult for programs to actually analyze that data. And so there's a spreadsheet lesson that's part of Data Carpentry that I've just put the link in at the bottom. And that one really highlights that difference between software and data carpentry for those who are interested. But it got supported by the Moore Foundation with a significant grant, which allowed Data Carpentry to start and run in parallel to software carpentry. But librarians kept coming and said, this stuff's pretty good, oh, I didn't see. I'll just finish this slide, and then it would be probably a good time to answer a question. So there was a great interest amongst libraries to host and attend workshops, but they didn't always get kind of the most out of the workshops that they actually attended. So this also happened with other groups. So there's other carpentries as well. There's Author Carpentry, and there's a link, you can go check them out. And so there's these other groups that have kind of splintered off and have really tried to focus on a particular skill set that might help a particular audience. So they're not formal carpentries like data and software carpentry are, but they are still interested in this carpentry mindset and of learning what the best tools are and teaching workshops. Was there a question? I'll wait in the chat just for a few seconds. No, I don't see a question. Okay, maybe I'll be happy to take them at the end, of course. Any thoughts about adding time to complete to the DC lessons? I'll answer that one at the end. So please, please remind me that that's a kind of a question about how the lessons are about data carpentry. So DC is the shorthand for data carpentry. Yes, I will like they do in software carpentry. Okay, I'll definitely come back to that. So what happened with me was I became an instructor trainer, or sorry, pardon me, an instructor in 2013. And the first workshops that it was requested for me to be the lead instructor at, I had helped at other workshops, but I'd never been kind of the primary instructor. And that's what the carpentries require to ensure quality workshops, is that there must be a certified instructor at any workshop that calls itself a carpentry workshop. And so the first one that I was requested to do was at the Edmonton Public Library. And then later that summer in 2014, Mozilla, so the organization that creates Firefox, hosted a software carpentry workshop, again, that software carpentry focus, but for librarians who lived in Toronto. And so I attended that one and helped instruct that one. And then it just happened that the New York Public Library the very next month wanted a workshop as well. And through the Toronto connection, I was the person, one of the people who went to go instruct it. And so we had very large audiences. We had about 30 or 40 people in Toronto, and then we had 80 people at the New York Public Library. We actually had 2 concurrent workshops going at the same time. And so it was, it showed the great interest for librarian amongst the library community. So I wrote a blog post about it. So you can see it there at the link on the bottom. Maybe I'll copy and paste it. About what I learned teaching boot camps to librarians. So there's some post-webinar reading for you. But at the same time, while software carpentry was handling this interest from librarians, there was lots of other things going on in the library community as well. So in 2013, the Harvard-Smithsonian Center created a workshop called Data Science Training for Librarians. Has anyone encountered DST for L? Yeah, so some people have heard of it. So it, we'll see a very happy connection with it a little bit later on in my presentation. Great work. I remember talking to those people, the people who were running DST for L and some other very interested librarians in the Boston area, like Andromeda Yelton, and we had lots of discussions about what should we do for this librarian community. There was also a workshop held at a Python programming conference called PyCon in Montreal in 2014, and there's a blog post there in the notes as well. And many people here are likely familiar with the Code for Lib group as well. So there was, again, lots of different things going on about teaching technical skills to librarians. And so DST, I'll just answer this question quickly. DST for L, has it gotten outside of Boston? DST for L, I don't think so. And the reason is because Chris Erdman, who was the person who founded it at the Harvard-Smithsonian, he actually encouraged people to go to software carpentry and request workshops, because software carpentry has had this culture of training other instructors, and they do it quite well. And so Chris said, I can't do all these workshops for DST for L, so go to the Carpentries. And so that is kind of what pushed a lot of those people towards the Carpentries. And again, I'll connect with DST for L a little bit later on. So what we in library carpentry think we have learned is, as some people said, relating to that image of books that I showed at the start, they're a broad group of people with very diverse skills, different work environments in terms of what they support and who they're trying to help. I find librarians are a very helpful group, and are often working to try to help other people get the most out of the library and whatever service aspect that library provides. So there's public library librarians, research librarians, the catalogers, the people who work in archives, the library technicians, and frontline library workers as well, who are all interested in seeing the changes that are coming into librarianship. But the question we had to answer was, do they actually need their own carpentry? Because we don't have chemist carpentry and we don't have biology carpentry. We custom tailor our workshops for those audiences, and that's something we could do with librarians. But I think the critical difference is my last bullet point there, which is librarians aren't just making use of the technology, which is usually what's happening with the chemists and the biologists and the other researchers. The librarians are a connection between services that libraries can provide and trying to encourage people to do things in more sustainable, accessible ways, and trying to make people effective in the research that they're trying to do. So they're passing on this information a lot. And so that's something that's important to discuss amongst the, preservation is a big part of it. The question in the chat there. If someone has a scientific result, the very essence of what that means is that that result is reproducible. And if you're going to reproduce it, you need everything. You need the original data that's there. You need the software that was used to, if there was calculations done. There's a neat example from the Scripps Institute. Dr. Jeffrey Chung, I believe his name was. He was a very successful scientist, and a postdoc researcher from another lab said, I want to reproduce your results. I've followed what you wrote in your academic papers, but I'm not getting exactly the results you said you should be getting. And so Jeffrey Chung eventually said, okay, here's the code that we used. It was written in a language called Perl, if you've ever heard of Perl. And this postdoctoral student went through it and tried to figure out what was going on. And he realized that it was using tabular data, sort of like a spreadsheet. And Jeffrey Chung's software was not including the last column of data. So he had to retract papers from Science, from Nature, because his results were not accurate. And that took a long period of time. Ultimately, the science was good. The results were republished, but it shows the need for reproducible research. So preservation is definitely a part of it. And we have to preserve everything, not just the software, but the data as well. How do we create a DOI or a persistent identifier for something so that years from now, someone can find that data if it was part of a scientific study? So with all this, library carpentry became a thing. And what it really came out of was in 2015, James Baker of the British Library put together a 4-week workshop titled as Library Carpentry. And so there's a link, it's still available online, nicely preserved. And I think the success here that some of those discussions we had prior to 2015 just didn't really click for was this session was organized for libraries by librarians at a well-known library like the British Library. And it created a critical mass of people who said, yes, let's try to do this in a carpentry way. So we now have an interim governance group, which is nicely international. We have people from the United States and the UK and Canada and South Africa, a mix of librarians and non-librarians, and people experienced in the carpentry's world. And lots of other people other than these 10 people shown here are involved, whether it's in lesson development, teaching, training. So there's a great group, and they're just some of the most wonderful people. So we have a website, which I've shown to you previous to this. So you can go check out that for more information. And now I'm going to talk to you about why you might want to have library carpentry at your institution, your library, wherever you are. Like, what's the sales pitch? We have great lessons and activities. One of the ones that James Baker came up with, which I thought was really great, which is more of an activity rather than one of the lessons, if you're familiar with software carpentry. It was just called jargon busting. And they spent about an hour and a half with flip charts, writing words down that librarians said, I've heard of this, people are asking for it, sounds like a good thing, but I don't really know what it is. Can we just talk about that? And so they ended up finding these little ad hoc groups that would form and just talk about if someone had some knowledge about trying to use that resource, whatever it was. And so that was something that, again, would not really have a place in the typical carpentries, but has been a great activity for the library carpentry sessions where it's been included. So there's also a data intro that's similar to something like what would come from data carpentry. Librarians love their clean, organized data, and so the Open Refine tool, or what used to be called Google Refine, is another lesson, very popular. Some of the other ones like Bash, the Bash shell, and SQL come out of the software carpentry and data carpentry lessons quite directly. In the works, we have some very library-centric lessons as well, such as fair data and digital preservation. So answering the question about preservation, really spending a significant amount of time, a whole lesson on how do we do proper digital preservation. All of our lessons live on GitHub, which is a tool we teach. We also teach, you'll see Git and GitHub as one of the lessons. If you go to the Library Carpentry organization on GitHub, so that's that link down there at the bottom, you can see all the sorts of lessons that are in development there. In terms of myself, after those 3 library carpentry workshops that I taught in 2014, I've been privileged to teach at other institutions as well. I taught at the Oregon Health and Science University. We had a workshop there for librarians with more of a research focus. The North Vancouver Public Library had a workshop as well, and then also in South Africa. We had a workshop in 2016. And so these are the different places I've been privileged to travel and get to know the different librarians around. So what will librarian workshop, what will we get out of library carpentry? Some librarians will benefit directly from the skills. So we don't have a lesson on MARC at present because it, again, isn't a broad enough skill, but a cataloger might save hours from doing things in MARC edit versus just writing some code in Python with PyMark. Some librarians pass along that information to help researchers clean their research data. And some librarians just really love the learning that comes from understanding understanding some of this technology in a deeper way, learning from other librarians and from the instructors. So I just have a few minutes. I need to leave some time for questions. I'll just highlight some exciting developments that are happening. We've had 219 library carpentry related events since 2013. We've had over 50 official library carpentry workshops, and we have 50 library carpentry instructors. We received an IMLS grant organized through the California Digital Library. This went directly to hiring Chris Erdman, who was the founder of DST4L. So he has come into, he was always very supportive of the carpentries, and now he's actually, this is his work, is to help with the library carpentry community and development director. So we're thrilled to have him on board. Belinda Weaver, who did a lot of work in Australia with the librarians that were interested in library carpentry. She has joined the carpentries as the community director for all of the carpentries, and a portion of her time goes specifically to supporting library carpentry. And just in the last few days, the Governance Council of Library Carpentry and the carpentries have agreed to officially bring library carpentry into the carpentries. And people might wonder why we would do that. It's so we can take advantage of their full-time staff resources in organizing workshops, take advantage of their training resources so that the librarians who are interested can become instructors. And in short, we just want to run better workshops. So ways that you can get involved: you can attend a workshop. You can look into hosting a workshop. It's very cost effective. Really, all you have to do is find instructors, and you may have to pay for flights and accommodation. But with the number that we have now, usually there's some that are relatively local, so that can help reduce it, reduce the cost. You can help at a workshop. You can join us. You can join one of our sprints where we work on the lessons and go over them. We just did this last month as part of the Mozilla Global Sprint, and we'll be doing it again in November. And so we're on Twitter. We have a chat that goes on with through Gitter. So not Twitter, but Gitter, which is organized by GitHub. You can join the Carpentry's mailing list, and there is one specific to software, to library carpentry, but the general discussion too, you see what's going on in the other carpentries, and you can learn from it. So I'm just going to jump back for a second to switch my screen, and this will be the last thing, and then I'll be happy to take some questions. So here's one of the people who attended the workshop in South Africa, named Erica Mias. She just tweeted this morning. You can see the date there. After attending my first Carpentry's workshop led by CJ McDonnell, I knew I wanted to become an instructor. Yesterday, I finally completed my instructor training. Looking forward to teaching my first lesson as a qualified instructor. So there's one more instructor, and we're always growing. And anyway, I'd be happy to take your questions. Make sure I can see my chat. Sprints are, they're not lessons. They're not tied to lessons. What they are is they come from the term code sprint, which is what software developers usually do, which is the lessons have to be improved. There's typos, there's things that are unclear. There's things, so someone mentioned the time estimation. Those could be added as well. You know, going through this lesson takes about half an hour. Going through this takes about 15 minutes, so you can plan your workshop. And so sprints are where we all work remotely. Some people get together, so different California libraries and places in Australia. I worked remotely from my basement, but other people get together, and you just try to carve out some time so you can really have discussions and focus. We have Zoom meetings. We talk about lessons which need attention, the digital preservation and fair data lessons. Those came out of the most recent sprint where a group of people said, yes, I think that's important and I'd like to help with it. Okay, so do you have a process to suggest a topic? Web accessibilities, that would be a sprint. Or again, if you get involved with some of the chat or the mailing list, you can suggest new lessons. And again, hopefully some other people would say, yes, I would like to do that, and can bring some other people in. Very good question about the fee. That fee applies to software carpentry and I believe data carpentry at this point. Library carpentry does not charge that fee. Software carpentry has gotten big enough that there's so many workshops going on that they really need to pay people to help organize them. And so while some grants do come in, such as the Moore Foundation or for Library Carpentry, IMLS, which can support some staff, they really need to help, they really need that money to help keep the lights on. But library carpentry, even as we merge into the carpentries officially, we've been granted the privilege to not charge that fee. But your organization would be expected to provide travel and accommodation for instructors. The instructors are not paid, we are volunteers, but just travel and accommodation. Certified instructors are not full-time. We're typically librarians, researchers, people who have a passion for this, graduate students, And so there's a few people who do work full-time for the Carpentries. Greg Wilson used to. Jonah Duckles is their executive director. Tracy Teal, who works for Data Carpentry. And Chris Erdman now with this grant works full-time. But they're usually doing more high-level stuff. But they will teach workshops from time to time as well. Any other questions? Just got maybe one or two more. There was one more question by Doug. Oh, Doug, about the Data Carpentry. I'm sure Data Carpentry would love to have time estimates on their lessons. We'll just need maybe in a sprint to have some people go through that and add them. And so they're certainly willing to do it, but it's just a question of person power. Quick question, DC instructors become LC instructors. As long as they've done instructor training and they've at least attended another workshop as a helper, which is you're not the instructor, but you just help people around the room when they run into issues. As long as you're a trained instructor, you can teach any of the workshops, Data Carpentry or Library Carpentry. So the instructor training is the same for all the carpentries.
So this is yes. Sorry, I have to cut short into discussion. So it seems like we have more questions, and according to our timeline, we have to let Clara present his material. So we can think we can leave all these questions at the end of the session. We have more time than that. So
yes,
so if we can go on to the timeline, that would be great.
Okay, so should I share my screen? Let me see. Okay, so here it is. Can you see it correctly? Do you need my volume up? Let me see. Let's see the chat.
They can see it.
Okay, sounds good. So thanks for having me here. What I'm going to do first is to tell you a little bit about myself and why I'm here. This is going to be a talk that is more of a use case, while Ken was explaining general things about library carpentry and the carpentries. I'm going to tell you about what I do with the carpentries for my job. My background is as a researcher. I did a PhD in oceanography. I worked for 4 years as a postdoc working on biogeochemical modeling, so I did a lot of coding. Like many researchers, I was self-taught, so I never learned coding from a class. I always learned it by myself. And then at some point I transitioned from my career as a researcher and I became a librarian. Now I work at Oregon State University Libraries as a data management specialist, which means that I support researchers on campus that have challenges regarding how to manage their data. I am a data carpentry and software carpentry instructor, and I very recently got certified as a lesson maintainer. So I'm going to be maintaining some lessons in Spanish. I'm originally from Barcelona. So I've participated in a few workshops. I wouldn't say I'm an expert. I would say I'm kind of a competent practitioner, and we'll hear this word later. And what I would like to talk to you about is how the carpentries help me teach research data management, how they help me in my job, and also how the carpentries teach me about teaching, so make me a better teacher so that I can teach research data management. I'll start with a very brief introduction about what my job is and what I do around data. I have here on the left the data life cycle from data one. So in short, you could start looking at it with a planning stage. So at the beginning of a research project, we plan what we're going to do with the data. Then at some point we start the project, we collect the data, we perform quality control on it, we describe it, document it, attach metadata. Then typically towards the end of the project, we preserve these data so that other people can discover, other people or ourselves in the future can discover these data, integrate it with our knowledge, other data, analyze it, and come up with new questions that will start the cycle again. So in my job, I try to support researchers with any question they have about data, so any questions in this cycle. But I'd say there are 3-star questions that I have, and these are the ones I have here. So 1-star question is to write a data management plan, and that's because many funding agencies require it. Writing a data management plan requires researchers to think about what they are going to do with their data through the whole data life cycle. So we get a lot of thinking about how to treat the data in these kind of consultations. The 2-star question that I must say, I'm surprised that I get it so much, I thought I wouldn't, is the data organization. So I get groups of researchers. Typically they are, several researchers. They have a consistent research plan. They've been working on the same type of research questions for many years. They have been collecting data for many years, and they're expecting to collect data for many other years. And at some point they realize that their data is so disorganized that they cannot find it and they cannot be efficient in analyzing the data and finding all the data that they can use to answer new questions. This is something that happens in many stages of the data life cycle. So when we talk with researchers about that, we kind of talk about many stages of their data. And finally, the 3rd-star question I get is how to prepare data sets for preservation. And that's mainly because we have an institutional repository, Scholars Archive, that accepts data. And we have a process in which this data goes through a review process. And I'm the one doing this review. That's why I do this so much. So what I check is that their data is generally organized, so that somebody that is not familiar with a project like me will generally understand it, that is in the right format, ideally open formats, actionable formats, and that it is documented. So Cam talked a little bit about this, but one of the key goals that we have when we work with researchers and data is to stress this idea of reproducibility. Doing good science means that you should be able, someone else should be able to do what you did again and get the same results, or do what you did again and get the same conclusions. And reproducibility is harder than it looks. And again, Cam touched on this, but I really like this concept of the reproducibility iceberg. We are used to thinking as reproducibility as something that we can get out of the method section of a paper. So if I want to reproduce someone else's research, I only need to go to the paper they publish, follow the instructions they have there, and I will be able to get exactly the same results. While in fact, there's so much more that affects what results we're going to get from particular data sets based on from a particular data set. So as an example, I told you that I was a modeler, and even though I worked with programs, just using the same program in a different computer sometimes gave me different results that made a difference. So having all these other information about what has affected the results that you get from a data set is very important for reproducibility. And here I have, three general ways of thinking about reproducibility. One would be computation reproducibility. I really like Cam's example about how getting the code was very important to ensure the reproducibility of that specific study. Which software do you use? Which hardware do you use? This can all impact your results. Empirical reproducibility would be all this information that is non-computational. So sometimes when I talk about reproducibility, people get confused because they think, well, if I'm studying this remote island in the Antarctica, my study is not reproducible or not very reproducible because just going to Antarctica and get all these samples, it's extremely hard. And even though this is true, what will make your research very reproducible is that you give these data that you took in Antarctica, so that other people can build on that, can reproduce what you did based on these raw data that you have. And finally, the third item for reproducibility is the statistical reproducibility. So which statistical test did you use? Which model parameters? How did you choose your threshold values, etc. So how to achieve reproducibility? A lot of it depends on workflows and tools. This is from a study that decided to break out the research process in these different, in these 6 different phases. So we have the discovery phase, how do we find information, the analysis phase, how do we treat this data we have, writing, to write the results, publishing the results, outreach, making these results known to other people, and assessment. And we have several workflows. The traditional, you're probably familiar with it. You discover data through Web of Science. You analyze your data with SPSS or Excel. You write your research with Word. You publish in a journal like Nature. You do your outreach with something like Researcher ID, and then you assess how well you did this job, how good this research is, but looking at the journal citation reports. There are other workflows that are arising, and the more tools that appear, the more workflows there are. There are probably as many workflows as researchers, but I would like to talk about this one because it's what we're trying to convince more people to do, which is basically, and I'm going to focus on this analysis part because it's what affects more the data part, which is instead of using something like Excel, use some programmatic language. It depends a lot on you as a researcher. It depends on the data you're using. It depends on how complex the analysis on this data is, whether in this case, R is a good tool for you or not. But what we're trying to avoid is having researchers use Excel because that's the only tool they know. In many cases, there are other tools that are a lot more efficient to use. So here is where the Carpentries step up. And so what I'm going to do in this next part is look at the lessons that the Carpentries have. And I'm going to use the word the Carpentries, that officially means data carpentry and software carpentry, but I'm kind of including library carpentry in these too. So I'm going to look at some of the lessons that have been developed in the Carpentries and how they help researchers in all these data management scenarios that I just told you about. And I'll focus in some challenges that I encounter when I try to teach data management. So, for example, Kim talked about it too. one of the challenges is to get people to use spreadsheets for what they are good. And that's one of the reasons I really like the data carpentry, data organization in spreadsheets lesson, because it's very good at describing what spreadsheets are good at and what they are not good at. There are reasons to use spreadsheets. We are not suggesting that people don't use spreadsheets at all, but it's good to use them for what they are good at. So the next challenge that we have for many researchers, Excel is not the most optimum tool to analyze their data. So what are the tools that they should learn? Programming is a very good skill to have. There are many lessons in software carpentry mainly that will teach you programming with Python, with R, with MATLAB. Another challenge that I talked about is organization of data. All these researchers that have a lot of data and they don't know how to organize it. Some of the lessons of the carpentries help with that. There's a lesson, for example, in databases and SQL. Keeping version control of data and code is a different way of keeping your data organized, knowing which are the different versions that you have and which one is the right version to use. There are lessons about version control with Git, version control with Mercurial. Another one of the challenges is for researchers to learn how to automate tasks. This comes from this problem that many researchers are using tools that they used to use because they worked just fine when they had 100 data points, but now it turns out that they have 10,000 new points of data every week, and they are still trying to have workflows like every week I go to my station and I download the data and I copy paste the data in this Excel file, and then I upload the plot that I was using and look at my sensor and see if it's working well or not. This is an example of, I worked with a student earlier this term, and he was planning on doing exactly that with his project. He had many sampling stations. So teaching, so this is obviously a workflow that is not efficient, and it will take so much of a researcher's time. So having researchers get to know how to do things automatically can be a big help. These are some examples of lessons in the carpentries that help to learn that. We have a lesson on the Unix shell. We have a lesson on automation and make. I included the data intro for librarians because I recently taught it, and it includes regular expressions. When we talk about data, and this is a little parenthesis, but when we talk about data, many times we think that data is just numbers, but data is really so much more than numbers. And for librarians, data may be just strings. So recognizing that it's not only useful for pure scientists, other disciplines have a lot to do with it. And here I come to my next challenges, which is related to disciplines. So I think that this is typical from librarianship. We have general messages that we give to researchers, but each researcher is such an individual case. Each researcher is working on a very specific research question with very specific data. Each discipline is different, and there are so many sub-disciplines that it becomes hard sometimes to really help these researchers just because we can't go deep enough in what they need to learn. No, we need to stay kind of in generalities. The carpentries help with that because they have, especially data carpentry, they have lessons that are more discipline specific. I believe that the genomics lessons are very popular. They are taught a lot. We also have a social sciences group, and I believe that this has been very active recently. The geospatial data group, there are still many lessons lacking, but there are some in there, and it's also being developed. I also found some other, random lessons like these data management in the ocean, weather and climate sciences. And there's of course the library carpentry, which is targeted to librarians. So that, I hope, was a clear view of how what the carpentries often offer, the content that the carpentries offer can help researchers who take these workshops to get better at data management in general. So what I'm going to do next is to talk about how the carpentries have helped me beyond this giving me the content of the lesson. And in particular, how the carpenters have helped me to grow as a teacher. So Cam talked about it too. To become a certified software carpentry or data carpentry instructor, you have to go through a 2-day workshop. I believe that some librarians have a good background in instruction. Some others, like me, may not. And outside of librarianship, in academia, it's very common to have researchers who are teaching who have never learned anything about how to teach. So this was my case. And going through this certification, this 2-day workshop was very useful for me to get some information, some scientific facts about how people learn. This is one of the things that are taught in these workshops that I find especially motivating, that really helped me, which is this concept about teaching without being an expert. And the metaphor that they use is that the difference between a competent practitioner and an expert is not in the amount of facts they know. In this representation, the facts would be the letters A, B, C, D, E. They know the same facts. But a competent practitioner, to go from A to E, may need to go through B, C, D, and E. So a competent practitioner has less connections between these pieces of knowledge, while an expert has more connections. So it's a lot easier for an expert to go from A to E without having to go through B, C, and D. When you are teaching novices, though, going through B, C, and D is very important. So you want, so that the learner can understand what the process is. So actually teaching without being an expert has some advantages. Experts have several limitations, and that doesn't mean that there are wonderful teachers that are experts too. But experts tend to have fluid representations. That means that they know how to do the same process in 2 different ways, and for them, these 2 ways are interchangeable, and they don't realize that changing from one to the other can be confusing to novices. Experts are very quick at diagnosing errors, so it's hard for them to go to the beginning and just explain the error little by little. And experts sometimes can have blind spots, which means that it's very hard for them to think about the world in a different way than what they are used to do through the tool that they are teaching. So this is something empowering from software carpentry. There's a lot of teaching without being an expert that is very, very useful. Another way that software carpentry has been useful has been just becoming part of the community. Cam talked about many ways of becoming involved. I have here a screenshot of how, the ways you can become involved from the website. I must say that I'm not a person who thrives in online communities, just because I tend to be shy, and being in front of a bunch of virtually unknown people is not easy for me. But every time I've done it in the carpentries, I've felt so comfortable and so welcome, and I felt that my opinion mattered, and there was a place for this opinion, and that has been great. The carpentries, like becoming involved in the carpentries, is a very good way also of starting working in open source projects, contributing to lessons. There's also a lot of room for doing things wrong and fixing them. Nobody expects you to do things perfectly the first time, and this is understood. So this has also been very nice. I also like that you are learning about what you are preaching by being involved in software carpentry. So one of the examples I like to give is that I used to do a lot of programming. I used Git every day of my life. I probably used most of the commands that you use from the lesson of Introduction to Git, but I had never worked outside of the command line. I didn't even have an account in GitHub. I had no idea how it worked. So being able to do these through contributing to lessons has helped me learn about it. Another way that being part of this community can benefit you is that members from this community publish scientific articles often about things that are relevant to data management. These are 3 examples. I like to pay attention to the monthly newsletter because it usually has listed the most recent articles in this field, and they tend to be very interesting. So that's a nice part of this community too. And I left for the end the most obvious way of taking advantage from the carpentries, which is reusing the content. So all the lessons are licensed with a Creative Commons attribution license. That means that anybody can use the content and modify them as long as they give attribution to software carpentry or data carpentry or the carpentries. So that has been very useful for me. Some ways that I've done these is we have here at the library a program, a series of workshops for grad students and faculty. And I've created a 2-hour workshop that is Introduction to Git, that is a summary, just a modification of the Introduction to Git lesson. I think that the Introduction to Git lesson is like more than 5 hours, so there's definitely more taught than what I'm teaching in this 2-hour workshop, but it's been great to have this material and being able to use it in this workshop. I've also included a part of the Spreadsheet Best Practices lesson into my Introduction to Data Management workshop, because so many people use Excel that I think it's very important to do that. I also teach each winter term 2 credits class for grad students on data management. And one of the goals I have is that they learn that all these tools exist. So I do very short introduction to several tools. So these are even shorter than these workshops, but we have one class on introduction to Git, one class on introduction to R, one class on spreadsheet best practices, and I've gotten all these materials from Software Carpentry and Data Carpentry. Another way of reusing the knowledge gotten from the carpentries has been to reuse the teaching method. So not the lessons that are there, but all these principles of how people are taught data skills and computing skills efficiently. So I designed another workshop, and this one was in LaTeX. There isn't an official LaTeX lesson. I think I found a very old one, and I used some of part of it, but I mainly developed it myself. But I did it using the Carpentry's principles on how to teach coding. So I do live coding and all that. I also found this blog post, I think it is, about other people who do that. So this is an example of a person who I don't happen to know, but he was writing this post about how he used the principles of software carpentry to teach a class on epidemiology and evidence-based health. So the method is definitely something useful to learn and apply to other areas. And finally, this is my last slide. This is reusing like anything from the carpentries for new ideas or applications. I think the idea of having open lessons and workshops in GitHub makes a lot of sense. Collaborative lesson development makes a lot of sense. Live coding makes a lot of sense. The different ways that the carpentries have of getting feedback, these are creative and useful ways of getting feedback. The structure of the workshops in which there's an instructor, but there are helpers that help the class go at the right pace. That's a very good thing to copy too. And that's the end of my talk. So if you have any questions, sorry I talked too much.
No.
It's a good time.
Are most of your classes taught to science folks?
I have actually a variety of students. So the question is, are most of your classes taught to science folks? I think in the last class I taught, there were people from the College of Liberal Arts. There were people who worked a lot with GIS. There was a person who worked with particle physics. And there was a couple of people in forestry. So they are very discipline diverse. So you use the built-in data sets then? So the classes I've used, yes, I follow, yes, because we don't. So during this class on data management, I don't ask them to have a data set to work on. I just ask them to have an idea of what this data set is so that they will be able to apply the concepts they learned to their data. But in order to make the classroom, flow nicely, I do use one data set for all when a data set is required. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's this person is saying, I asked this question because some humanities students might not click with science data. And it's true, and there was definitely some people who, with the introduction to Git, were, what? This is not useful for me. But at least now they know it exists. And they know that if at some point they start working with different kind of data, or maybe they start coding, because even the humanities people can benefit from coding sometimes, depends on your data, they know it exists.
And I think the Git intro has been revised to actually not be as science focused from the software carpentries because they want to make sure that it does click with as broad an audience as possible. So which data sets to use is a very regular conversation.
Mm-hmm. Carpentry topics are diverse and we have no clear interest or demand, from grad students or faculty. That's the best way for us to get started.
I would start with a poll. You could, again, you don't need a huge throng of people to start to host a workshop. So 10 is a really great number to start with, particularly if it's new, to see what the interest is, and it'll grow kind of through a grassroots approach, I find. You could always send out an interest. You never know who's heard of the Carpentries and just doesn't have the time to speak up about organizing a workshop, I think. So if you have a big mailing list of people at an institution, or people who might have the money to offset some of those costs and just say, we'd like to do this, there's probably more people who are interested than you might be aware of, even though they haven't explicitly expressed that interest yet.
So this is Minhao. I'm sorry I have to jump in again. And I saw a lot of folks are leaving right now, and we would really appreciate you filling out our evaluation survey. I guess I should share my screen first. Before you leaving, so.
Doug, I have not taught a semester-long course on it. One of the board members, or former board members, Ethan White, who is a faculty member in Florida, he has taught. He's been around for a long time, and I will. I think I'll try to dig up some articles about people who've taught it across a whole semester, but it has been done.
I have been, I teach a semester-long course, but like I've included some of the lessons as part of this course, like 3 different classes, but the general course is about, data management, and we talk about other things. So I'm not sure if you are looking into getting one of these lessons or a few lessons and making them semester long, or just including them in little pieces. That's what I've done. Yeah, just including them. It's a little challenging because, at least in my case, I tried to make them short. So just modifying a 5-hour-long class into a 1-hour class, there's only so much you can do. That was the most challenging part. But I guess if you have more time, you can devote more hours.
So are there more questions for Cam and Clara? Okay, I think it's time to wrap up the whole session. So thanks for being part of this forum. And as you can see in the top URL and the slides, we have prepared a list of resources related to today's topic. Jane, can you please also place the URL into the chat feature? And this URL is publicly available for you. And if you have something to say about our session, please do fill out the evaluation survey, as I said before. And last but not least, I would like to say thank you to our speakers, Cam and Clara, for joining us today and giving fantastic presentations. And we are going to have another forum later this year, so stay tuned on that. Other than that, enjoy the rest of the day. Oh, no problem. Thanks for everyone for coming.